Okay, in this final video, we're on the content of the westward expansion or colonization of the West, part of the American West topic. We're going to look at the sort of last examples of migrations to the West with the Exodusters movement and the Oklahoma land rush. Now, these kind of, as I say, represent the last great examples of people moving from the East into the area regarded as the West. And they're significant in different ways, as we'll see. The Exodusters were former African American slaves who'd been liberated at the end of the Civil War, and they were moving from the south of the USA into Kansas and Oklahoma predominantly. They left the South in the 1870s to go to Kansas in search of a better life because the Civil War and emancipation had not brought dramatic improvement in the status of African Americans. In fact, what was starting to happen was the development of segregation, the Jim Crow segregation laws that the likes of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks would so famously protest about in the South in the 1960s. Those laws were coming into force in the 1870s, 1880s, and clearly many African Americans felt that the South offered no future for them. So by the South, we mean states like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, those former Confederate states that fought to defend slavery in the Civil War. So these African Americans wanted to take advantage of the Homestead Act to get cheap land, and Kansas was seen as a friendly state for African Americans because Kansas had been involved in some of the events in the run-up to the Civil War where slavery had been rejected, and this had caused great tension between the northern and the southern states. So it seems a friendly state for African Americans. These migrants became known as Exodusters. That name derives from the book of Exodus in the Bible, and the sort of exodus of the Jews led by Moses out of Israel. And there was a significant religious element in this move west. The African American community in the South was a highly religious, highly Christian community. As a result of the sort of enslavement in many respects. If we just look at this map here, it just kind of shows where they're going, and you can see there at the bottom right-hand corner, this area, these kind of areas, places like Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas, Missouri up here. African Americans from these states were looking to move, first of all, to Kansas. We see that about 6,000 Exodusters migrated first to St. Louis in Missouri, the sort of gateway city to the west, and then on into Kansas. And we can see some of the settlements that they established here. These were initially, up here, places like Nicodemus, for example, Millbrook. These were essentially all black settlements in the first instance. And you can see that the population of Kansas, the African American population of Kansas, dramatically increased from 627 in 1860, so before the Civil War, to 43,110 by 1880. Now, that movement struggled in Kansas. There were lots of problems. So many of those Exodusters then moved further to the south into Oklahoma and set up settlements there as well. Now, this slide comes from the lesson that we did on this. I'm just trying to use some of these points as prompts. To help you think about what you need to know, and then you could look at the revision guide and have a look at these questions if you want to consolidate knowledge. The Exodusters moved to Kansas, as we said, for a range of reasons, because of the oppression of the segregation laws, because of the Homestead Act. A key guy is a guy called Benjamin Singleton, and it's Benjamin Singleton that's kind of the leader of the Exodusters that's kind of trying to persuade people to come out to Kansas, and they put in place newspaper adverts to persuade people to come to Kansas. But they experience a lot of problems. The land is very poor quality. A lot of the good land in Kansas has already been taken up by the Homestead Act. So there's a lack of good quality land. Many of the African Americans are very poor. There was no kind of reparations given to these former slaves when slavery ended. There was no kind of compensation. In fact, the people that were compensated were the slave owners. It was the ex-slave owners that tended to get more compensation than the slaves, which just seems bizarre. A very similar thing happened, in fact, in the British Empire as well, when slavery was abolished in the early 19th century. Many of the African Americans also got very sick. Yellow fever was a big problem. Many African Americans suffered with significant ill health. And there was also significant opposition from white Americans who, those white Americans in Kansas were not wild about thousands of African Americans coming into their state. Again, just because Kansas was a anti-slavery state did not mean that they were committed to racial equality by any means. And it's important to understand that was the case. And so the ex-Duster movement kind of peters out a little bit in the 1880s. We do get more people coming over, but probably in lower numbers. They're better prepared, and they focus instead of going to Oklahoma. And Oklahoma, of course, that leads us on to our next clip, which is our next section, which is on the land rush. And Oklahoma, of course, at this time was Indian territory. This was land that had been given to the tribes forcibly moved from the southeast in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So tribes like the Cherokee and the Choctaws that were not Plains Indians, but they lived in the southeast of the United States, and they'd been moved in devastating marches, which had led to thousands of deaths into this territory in Oklahoma, kind of the southern end of the plains. Now, by the time we get to the 1880s, 1890s, this is the last kind of uncolonized area of the United States. And the United States is keen to square the circle, and they put in place a series of land rushes where literally they basically assign, they basically kind of take an area of land and divide it into plots, and people race to capture, to gain the best plots of land. And the clip below shows you a clip from a film of the 1980s called Hope and Glory, which kind of shows you literally how that works. Literally, they queue at almost like a starting line, and someone fires a gun, and off they go to try and race to get the best bits of land, bits with water supplies, and so on. And this basically leads to the kind of the incorporation of Indian territory into the state of Oklahoma and then into the United States, and it represents a kind of final betrayal of those Indians who've been told when they were frog marched out of Florida and Georgia and so on into this territory, they were told this area was going to be theirs for all time. And of course, it was another betrayal by the US government of Native American peoples. And ultimately, that would, in a sense, bring a conclusion to the story of the migration, the settlement of the West, the settlement of, broadly speaking, principally of white peoples, but also other groups coming from the United States of this West. And by 1890, of course, the US Census Bureau declares that the frontier is closed, that the whole of the United States has been colonized, that the United States, in a sense, has achieved that manifest or fulfilled that manifest destiny that we spoke about in the first video.